Thank you so much. Were you ever unpleasantly surprised by employees' behavior? That happened to you sometimes? Did you ever wonder why they behave that way? Or how you can address their behavior to be more aligned with organizational priorities? That's what we'll be talking about today. Why employees surprise you with their behavior. Why they behave in a way that's unexpected, counterintuitive, not aligned with organizational priorities, and how can you shift their behaviors to be more aligned with organizational priorities. So we will be talking about this using social intelligence research. Now, social intelligence has behavioral economics, psychology, and so on. It's a whole field devoted to a couple of topics. And this is the Ashhra, part of the Ashhra HR delivery model, lead with your heart model, the people strategies, and personal leadership, how you can improve your leadership through social intelligence skills. Now, I'm often asked, what is social intelligence? So what is that concept? How many of you heard of emotional intelligence? Please raise your hand. Great, okay. How many of you heard of social intelligence? Raise your hand. Okay, perfect. So I see that about 90% of you heard about social emotional intelligence, and about maybe 5% of you heard about social intelligence. Great. So let's talk a little bit about what the difference is between those two topics. Now, emotional intelligence refers to self-awareness. And here is where I want you to turn to your handout, which will come in handy. You will have notes, space for yourself to take notes on each of these topics. So that's what the handout is for. If you turn to the third page of the handout, the first is the session, second is bio, third is space for you to take notes, and on each of these topics. So I strongly recommend that that's what you do with it. Next one.
Oh, I'm going to do it on my phone.
Excellent, okay. You totally okay. Great. Some people like to do it on their phone. I bring handouts because I know many people like to do it on handouts. Right, perfect. So emotional intelligence has to do with awareness and management. Has to do with awareness of your feelings, your emotional drivers, your moods, and then the ability to manage those, to manage your feelings, your emotional drivers, your moods. That's what emotional intelligence is. That's probably what you heard about. Social intelligence is more cutting-edge research. It's awareness of other people's feelings, awareness of their moods, awareness of their emotional drivers, and then the ability to manage their moods, to manage their emotional drivers. Of course, that's what you want to do to align them with organizational priorities. Awareness and management. So those are the two key components of social intelligence that we'll be talking about. Now, socially intelligent HR leaders, it's a term for HR leaders who are capable of using social intelligence strategies to direct their organization, to be aware of what's going on with their employees, and to be able to manage their employees to achieve the goals of the organization. So hopefully all of you will leave this session as more socially intelligent HR leaders than you came in with. Unfortunately, it's rare despite the research showing that social intelligence is incredibly important for HR leadership in a variety of fields. We can talk about this research in questions and answers if you're curious about it. Now, I'm going to start with an example of social intelligence, kind of grounding it out. We talked a little bit about broad theory. Now, what does it look like on the ground level? Now, some of you might be familiar with this picture. Don't give away the answers to those who aren't. Now, raise your hand if you see a young woman. Raise your hand. Lower your hand. Raise your hand if you see an old woman. Great. So I see a bunch of people raised hands on both, a bunch of people raised hands on one, and a bunch of people raised hands on the other. Now, this picture is deliberately ambiguous and speaks about the pessimism bias and the optimism bias. So let's talk a little bit about what those two are. Now, for people who don't believe this is ambiguous, take a look at this. The original picture is the one at the top. The picture on the left, of course, looks more like a young woman. The picture on the right looks more like an older woman. It's a deliberately ambiguous picture. People who are pessimists tend more often to see an older woman. people who are optimists tend more often to see a younger woman. Not always, but that's a tendency. Now, what's pessimism and optimism bias? This is one of the social intelligence research strategies. Some of the things we find is that people experience a bias either to be optimists or to be pessimists. If they're optimists, they tend to have an unrealistic evaluation of reality, a very positively unrealistic evaluation of reality. If they're pessimists, they tend to have the opposite, an unrealistically negative evaluation of reality. All of us tend to be somewhere on the spectrum. Somewhere. It's very rare for someone to be perfectly aligned with what reality actually looks like. Now, this is a bias that I have personal experience with, and that has led to some trouble in my own life. So I started my business on speaking, consulting, coaching, disaster avoidance experts in 2014 with my wife. Now, I'm really optimistic. I really think the grass is green on the other side, so we're planning this business, and I was kind of describing, this is where the future will go, this will be great, it'll be beautiful. And then she was like, well, whoa, hold your horses. The grass is yellow on the other side. It's not going to be as nice as you think it will be. So that led to a lot of conflicts between the two of us. And we couldn't figure out the source of the conflicts at first, kind of why were we seeing reality differently? Well, we were married since 2003, but we didn't really collaborate on any major projects until this time, until we started working on this professional thing together. And so that led to a lot of tensions in our marriage, in our business. That was a big problem. And so this is something I see quite often in organizations. So I was consulting for long-term healthcare nonprofit in Seattle with about 140 staff. And they were dealing with some major issues recently where there's a decline in Medicare A patients, which are more lucrative patients, and the growth in managed care patients who are less lucrative. So that was a major problem, and they had a real culture where they don't want to cut staff, and they really care about their staff. The leadership really didn't want to cut staff. So there was a lot of fighting, a lot of conflict within the top-level leadership. And there were some folks who were proposing a whole bunch of ideas. They were saying, hey, we can do this. Hey, we can do that. And you know what? There were other people who were saying, no, that's a bad idea. How can you do that? How can you even suggest it? And what was happening was that the optimists were generating a lot of ideas. The optimists tend to generate ideas that are great at brainstorming. They say, hey, here's what we can do. Here's what we can do. Here's what we can do. And then pessimists feel overwhelmed. They feel, whoa, there's so many bad things about those ideas. Those can go wrong in so many ways. And what the groups feel, here are the emotional drivers, is that they're fighting with each other. The optimists feel like the pessimists are just being, downers, shooting down all their ideas. And what do the pessimists feel? The pessimists feel that the optimists are going off half-cocked with ideas that just don't sound good, that just don't work. So what my wife and I learned, what I later brought to this nonprofit in dealing with this strategy, and that's something based on the research on this topic, is that you don't want to have them fight each other. You want to separate the two processes of idea generation and idea improvement. So the optimists in your team can specifically work on generating ideas. They can be the folks who are responsible for creating ideas and bringing them to the table. Optimists are great at it. Pessimists are not. They intuitively see a lot of flaws with each idea, so they tend to come up with very few ideas. But what they're great at is taking those half-baked ideas, choosing the ones that deserve to be baked further, and coming up with a potato pie. That's what they're great at. That's their strength. And so that's what happened at that Seattle nonprofit. And it worked out really well. So I checked in about a year later now. They had declines in their finances, in their revenue of about 3%, but they figured out how to cut costs by about 8%. So overall, of course, they came out ahead because they collaborated on these ideas. So that's the kind of benefits you can get from this sort of collaboration. So that's a ground level example of how this works in healthcare settings. So let's talk a little bit about what the presentation overview will be, what we'll talk about. We'll talk about the social intelligence and HR healthcare leadership. We'll talk about a strategy that you can use to address problems, so science-based strategy, and then we'll do session wrap-up. That will be what it's about. Now, I want you to start, and there's place in the handout for this, by writing down, take 30 seconds to write down a significant challenge you think might be addressed by social intelligence-based strategies in your organization. Now, the reason I want you to write it down is that I want you to be thinking about it as we go through the presentation. So take 30 seconds, please write one down. In the handout or on your phone. All right. Now, there are going to be 3 key takeaways that I want you to be thinking about as you're going through this process, as you're thinking about things. And they will sound, especially the first one, will sound somewhat counterintuitive. You should not trust your gut. Don't trust your gut. You'll hear a lot of people telling you, trust your intuitions, trust your gut, trust your reactions. Don't. It's bad advice in HR healthcare settings. And we'll talk about why. Avoid cognitive biases. We'll talk about what those are. Those are basic thinking errors that we human beings tend to make because we're not evolved for the current environment. We'll talk about that in more depth. And for major decisions, use science-based decision-making strategies, not intuitive decision-making strategies. We unfortunately are not taught how to make decisions. It's a fundamental flaw in all sorts of education. And so there's some recent research in social intelligence and other topics showing how you can best make decisions to reach your goals. Let's talk a little bit about our evolutionary heritage, because to get to the future of effective healthcare HR leadership, we need to go back into the past. So imagine you're sitting by the campfire in your distant ancestors, sharing food, sharing stories, the Paleolithic era, and suddenly there's a war cry. Some other enemies are coming to attack your tribe. Now, all the men are grabbing their weapons and coming to the entrance of the cave. The women are grabbing the children, going back into the cave. That's the kind of environment in which we evolved. The fight or flight response was crucial for our survival. So that was when we were fighting other tribes. Same thing when we were facing saber-toothed tigers. You might have heard of this as a saber-toothed tiger response, the fight or flight response. And that is fundamental to understanding where we are right now. That is how we're wired. We have not evolved beyond the savanna environment. We evolved culturally. We have not evolved genetically. So if we were deposited, all of us, back in that environment, we would end up exactly like these people. We would not end up any different, not with our current knowledge, but if we were raised in that environment. We're not genetically any different from that environment. We're evolved for that environment. And so this is a huge problem for us because we are triggered, and when we're triggered, when we have certain emotions, we go into the fight or flight mode, and we feel that we are being attacked as though there's an enemy tribe attacking us, as though it's that dangerous, or if there's a saber-toothed tiger somewhere around. That was crucial for us to have those fight or flight responses to survive. So we are the children. We are all the children of the people who survived because they had strong fight or flight responses and because they were strongly tribal. So tribalism is in our genes, it's in our blood, it's who we are. Now, unfortunately, tribalism impedes very many HR best practices, and so does the fight or flight response. And we have to struggle against these things in order to achieve our goals. Now, you can see this on your everyday level. So, for lunch today, for example, there were delicious free food, cookies available. It's very difficult to resist those things. How easy is it to resist cookies? It's not easy. I mean, my Achilles heel is cheesecake. I mean, you just have to say it. It's very hard to resist it for me. Now, why is that? I mean, it's not like it's a good thing for us to eat as much sugar as possible. Of course it's not. It's tasty, but it's not. We are evolved to want sugar. We are evolved to want as much of that tasteful sensation as possible. That's really important for survival in that sort of environment where our ancestors were. So if we found honey, if we found sugar, we needed to eat as much of it as possible. So we are triggered, our taste sensations are triggered when we feel sugar, and we consume as much of it as we can. And that's a very big problem in our current environment. Same thing comes from tribalism. That's a major reason for various forms of discrimination in the workplace. Sexism, gender, LGBTQ, religion, politics, and so on. Disability. People perceive those that they discriminate against as not part of their tribe. That's the basic perception. It's not that the people who engage in discrimination are bad people. They are just wired in such a way that we're all wired, to be tribal. And because of that tribalism, we make really bad choices that really harm our personal health, with the example of sugar, and organizational culture, with the example of tribalism. Now, let's talk a little bit about the basic brain structure. We are wired. We tend to think that we are the person, the brain on the left, that we are rational, reasonable beings. In reality, what scholars have been showing by recent research is that we tend to be mainly dominated by emotions, by our intuitions. There's a metaphor that they tend to use of the elephant and the rider, where the rider is the rational self, and the elephant is the emotions, is the intuitions. It's as hard to control our emotions as it is to control an elephant. Now, we could guide it in the long term to where we want it to go, the elephant, our emotions, our intuitions. But in the short term, they're very difficult to control and manage. So our decision-making is guided to about 80 to 90% by emotions, by intuitions, by habits. And that's what we're struggling against, folks, those 80 to 90%, when we're trying to lead people to go against where they intuitively go according to their tribal responses. The vast majority of problems that you're having with your employees come from this tension between the tribalism and modern corporate environment and healthcare environment, of course. Now, let's talk a little bit about how our mind works, what the recent findings are. You might have heard about the id and the subconscious and the superego, the Freudian model. That has been way superseded by recent research. There are two broad systems of thinking which can interact with each other, unlike Freud's idea of id, superego, and so on. The system one, or what I prefer to name the autopilot system, and that's the elephant part of ourselves. Now, that's a subconscious system. That's the older system. You might have heard of it as the lizard brain system. It's habitual, automatic, fast, intuitive, emotional, associated with the amygdala, the older part of the brain. Turns on in milliseconds. Very easy. We tend to be mostly guided by that part of our brains. There's also another system called the intentional system, or system 2. System 2 is much weaker, much, much weaker. So it takes about a second to turn on, so it's much slower. It's conscious, mindful, attentive. We have to focus to use it. So when you're trying to resist that second cookie, that's what you're using, your intentional system. Or when you're trying to resist interrupting someone when they're talking, that's also what you're using. Now, for a workplace context, consider a situation where a supervisor is giving some constructive critical feedback. It's a very important part of the supervisor's job to give constructive critical feedback. Because of our tribal intuitions, the tendency that we experience when we hear constructive critical feedback is not to incorporate the feedback and say, yes, I'll do better next time, definitely follow these guidelines. That's not what we want to do. We're like, la, 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 I can't hear you. That's kind of the tendency. That's what we want to do. And that's the fight or flight response because we feel threatened. We feel attacked. We don't feel helped or cared for by that constructive critical feedback. And that's something that we need to address and figure out how to address. So cognitive biases is the next thing that I want to talk about. Cognitive bias, the system one, the autopilot system, makes hundreds of mistakes. And that's the cognitive biases. System 2 also makes mistakes, the intentional system. Most of these come from the emotional drivers. Researchers have discovered over 100 specific errors that we tend to make as human beings that are fundamentally undermining our capacity to behave well in a personal context, in our personal life, and in organizational life. The pessimism and optimism bias were just two of these, and we'll talk about a couple more in this presentation. What I want, every one of you should have my book, The Truth Seeker's Handbook, a science-based guide. It's provided to you compliments of Ashhra, so thank Ashhra for that. And it describes a number of these biases and how to address them in a variety of contexts. So let's talk a little bit about these biases. The halo effect and the horns effect. Now, this is a big one that I wanted to make sure to touch upon. And this has to do with tribalism. I live in Columbus, Ohio. And in fact, I used to be a professor at Ohio State University. And as you can imagine, we were contractually obligated to root for the Buckeyes in that sort of setting. Now, whenever I give this presentation in Columbus, I gave it to the local SHRM group, so the Society for Human Resource Management. I asked them, how many of you would hire a Michigan fan? Now, Michigan, for those, I hear some people laughing, is the big rival of Buckeyes. Now, this was an audience of human resource professionals. How many of them out of 100 do you think said that they would hire a Michigan fan? How many hands went up? Guesses, wild guesses.
Half.
Half, okay, half. Others?
Five.
Five, okay. Others? Anybody else?
One.
One. Okay. 5 is right. So you're exactly right, 5. You were very optimistic. You're definitely on the optimism scale. So this is obviously something that we need to address. So 5 people in human resources indicated that they would hire a Michigan fan. Not great, right? This is a problem. This is a huge problem. And the halo and horns effect is to blame. So that's the problem that we need to deal with. The halo effect refers to somebody, when we like one characteristic of somebody, we will tend to like all of their other characteristics. So if somebody is a Buckeye fan and we are also Buckeye fans, we will tend to evaluate that person better as an employee, as a friend, as a romantic partner, and for any other purposes. And that's a huge problem when we do that. The opposite is the horns effect. The horns effect refers to when we don't like one characteristic of someone, we will tend to evaluate them in a more negative fashion. Whether as an employee, as a business collaborator, as a vendor, any of these areas in professional settings. Ooh, mic went up, good. In any of these settings, we will tend to evaluate these people as more negatively, and of course, in all sorts of personal life issues as well. So this is another big problem that we have to fight with in healthcare settings. It's especially dangerous and biased for assessments and promotions. So I was working with the HR VP in a New York City hospital of about 8,000 staff, and she was not very happy with the diversity hires. They were doing a lot of work to incentivize diversity hires in the hospital, so that was great. But they weren't getting the kind of the hires that they were really looking for to engage with their multicultural population in New York City. And so she brought me in to figure out what's going on about this, in this topic. And what I found was that there was indeed really good incentives for actual hiring of people with diversity, so addressing the halo effect, but they weren't really addressing the horns effect. They were addressing the horns effect, they weren't really addressing the halo effect. They weren't addressing the tendency of people to hire the same people as themselves. So not simply by color, by color of the skin, not simply by religion, by gender, by sexual preference, but also things like cultural background. Which region of the country did you come from? What language comfort do you speak? What economic background do you have? I mean, what college you went to? So all of these things were really negatively impacting the hiring process. And once we address that, and I could talk about how we address that in Q&A, the things really greatly improved in diversity hiring. So that's an example of how to address the halo and horns effect. Now, I want you right now to go to an exercise of, actually, I'll take a couple of questions before we go to this exercise. So if anybody has any questions about what went so far, what we went over so far, and then we'll go to an exercise. Any questions?
Is it possible to change in your lifetime from a pessimist to an optimist or vice versa?
Great. So the question was, is it possible to change in your lifetime from pessimist to an optimist? It's not possible to change your basic intuitions. What's possible is to learn about them and take deliberate steps to address them. So I've learned that I'm an optimist from the research on this topic and how I address these things. So what I have learned to do is be skeptical of my own ideas, start to see them as intuitively half-baked, not as wonderful and great, and to run them by people with a more pessimistic perspective, whether my wife or other collaborators, other mentors who I have who are more pessimistic. So there are specific science-based steps that you can take to address your intuitive problematic tendencies.
So you can train yourself.
Exactly, and that's where you use your intentional system, system 2, to build new mental habits that help you address the negative tendencies of the autopilot system. All right. So, find a buddy and discuss how you will integrate the information that you got so far into your organization. Write down in the handout or in your notes at least one step that you will take to integrate this information. Okay? So please go ahead. Just have a couple more slides left of this presentation and remind you of the 3 key takeaways that we talked about in the presentation so far. I want you to remember to not trust your gut. We are often told to trust our gut. It feels very comfortable. It's not true. Unfortunately, our gut often lies to us. We mistake the feeling of comfort of people in our tribe, of our gut intuitions, of fight or flight response. It feels very comfortable. And what we feel comfortable with, we mistake it for being accurate, true, wise, and good. And our gut lies to us all the time in situations that don't resemble the savanna environment when we lived in small tribes. If we know somebody for a while, if they're part of our family, then we can read them well. Then those are situations where we can trust our gut much more. For very many situations, like in modern healthcare, corporate, business environments, organizational environments, those are bad places to trust our gut. Be aware of cognitive biases. There are over 100. The book describes a bunch of them that you can go and read about the rest. I recommend for people who want to do higher level studying, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. So that's a really good book on a whole bunch of cognitive biases. And finally, use science-based decision-making strategies. We talked about a few of them in the presentation. The book talks about much more. When I do a half-day workshop or a full-day workshop, I go for a bunch more science-based decision-making strategies. The tips and guidelines sheets that I'll send out have a bunch of those strategies that you can apply in your organizational context. Now, I want you to encourage you to invest in social intelligence strategies for HR leadership success. I think you will get a lot out of it if you do. It's going to be really important for the success of your organization. Understanding and influencing other people's emotions, let me remind you, is what social intelligence is about. And that's really, in essence, what HR is about. Influencing, being aware of other people, their emotions, because emotions drive us about 80 to 90% of the time. Understanding them, influencing them to align them with the organization's priorities and goals. There are lots of flaws, human thinking flaws, that cause us to make bad mistakes. Pessimism and optimism bias and Hale and Horn's effect were just 4 of the over 100 of these problems. So I want you to think about where and how you can invest in social intelligence strategies in your organization. And I want to challenge you to invest at least 10% of your HR development resources, organizational resources, into social intelligence-based strategies over the next 3 months and see what kind of difference it will make in improving your outcomes and helping you move your people toward where you want them to do, whether with Amy, with the kind of challenges she's having with Halo and the Horns effect, or Pat and Shauna with Sharon with collaborating together to achieve much better outcomes. Think about ways that you can address the kind of problems that we all have just because of our evolutionary background. And I want you to think about the story that you'll tell yourselves after you come back from this trip and from this panel. Will you tell yourself that you heard a ground-changing presentation and then you came back home and you kind of let it slip between the cracks and didn't implement strategies from it in your organization? That's what happens often with these presentations at these conferences. Or will you say, hey, I heard a paradigm-shifting presentation here, and I'm really determined to integrate these strategies into my context. I'm determined to put them into action. There's a reason that Ashhra provided you with the book that you have all right now. You can use that. You can take it away and use that and use what you gained here to really change your organization based on cutting-edge strategies to achieve organizational goals and priorities. So I think all of you could do it. I think all of you can be the kind of HR, healthcare leaders that your organization needs. And I hope that all of you will tell yourselves the story that you did implement the paradigm-shifting information that you heard here. And I really appreciate you all having come here. Thank you very much.